The Greens leader, Senator Christine Milne, is just standing up for a media conference, so we'll go there live now.
To native title legislation in Australia. The Greens have been leading the campaign for these changes for a very long time, but we're disappointed that the Attorney-General is not moving on the most fundamental reform. It's a reform that's been supported by the Chief Justice and also by the leaders in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community throughout the nation, and that is reversing the onus of proof. Currently, Indigenous people have to prove that they have had an ongoing connection to the land. What ought to happen is that that be assumed as being the case and that the onus of proof is the reverse. So now we've got a situation where we agree on good faith negotiation. That is in Senator Siewert's bill. We also agree with regard to disregarding extinguishments of native title in regard to national parks and other areas, but our bill goes further than that and looks at other land tenures. We'd be inviting the government to support the Greens legislation, which we'll be debating in the Senate in the coming weeks, but particularly we'd like the Attorney-General to think again. She has said she doesn't think reversing the onus of proof would get through the current parliament. She hasn't tested that. The Greens believe this is fundamental and we will support it. So I would call on Minister Roxon not to use that as an excuse, but rather to go ahead with this fundamental reform.
What are the impediments for Indigenous people with this burden of proof as it stands?
When the Mabo decision came 20 years ago, there was great excitement across the country, thinking that this would lead to quite well-processed, in reasonable time, claims for native title. That hasn't happened. Many native title claims have been put in and people making the claims have died before they've been able to be finalised, and that's because it's a very difficult thing to prove in many cases, that connection to the land that has been ongoing over a very long period of time. What we should be assuming is that the connection to land is there, and it is up to people who want to oppose it to prove that it's not there, not the other way around.
Now, you're saying that one of the excuses that's been given is that it's unlikely to get through Parliament. Who would oppose it going through Parliament? Who do you think would be your toughest opposition to get it through?
Well, until the Attorney-General tests it with the Parliament, it's hard to know who is going to oppose it. That's why I'm saying the Greens are here to support this amendment. It is part of Senator Rachel Siewert's bill. We are going to be debating it in the next couple of weeks. The Greens are right there to say, let's reverse the onus of proof. If the government agrees, let's reverse the onus of proof, then it's a matter of negotiation with the coalition and with the other independent members of Parliament. But I'd like to try. This is a window of opportunity to actually speed up native title, and if you really want to pay tribute to Eddie Mabo and the decision of 20 years ago, then we should be listening to the leaders in the community who are saying, now let's get this right, let's overturn the fundamental barrier to achieving native title for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
But if you reverse the onus of proof, would that leave some land vulnerable, or would that create a whole lot of conflict in some areas where land is now in other people's hands?
One of the reasons, no doubt, that the Attorney-General says that she's not confident she would get the numbers in Parliament is because there will be people who have land at the moment who would be concerned about that. But if you look at the hysteria that occurred 20 years ago about how the Mabo decision was going to disrupt life as we knew it in Australia, and of course it didn't come to pass. So let's actually test this in a very rational and reasonable manner, and let's learn from the fact that the hysteria didn't come to anything, and that all of that has led to delayed processing of claims for native title. We need to fix this up. If we really want to be proud about reconciliation with Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, then we need to remove this barrier. On Gonski. Everybody in the education community across Australia has been looking for the opportunity to properly invest in education in this country. We are falling behind the rest of the world, and we had with the Gonski Review a thorough look at how schools are funded in Australia and how we are falling behind. And the burden, of course, has gone largely to public education, because it is in public schools that those who are often the most disadvantaged are educated, and it is in public schools that the inequity has really bitten hard. We've got a situation where the difference between the top 20% of students in grade 9 and the lowest 20% of students in grade 9 is the equivalent of 5.5 years of schooling. How can that be in this country? The Gonski Review have said, let's have a look at this, let's fund education on the basis of need, and let's invest at least $5 billion a year. And with $5 billion a year, we would only go to the middle ranks of OECD countries in terms of education funding. Now, the government has said it is looking at Gonski. The minister said that we would legislate by the end of the year, but there is real stress out there in the education community right now and the broader community, because the minister has reported today saying maybe the legislation won't be in by the end of the year, and maybe there'll be a need to extend beyond 2013 the inequitable funding model which sees public education so poorly funded around the country. Well, that simply can't be allowed to happen. We need an assurance from the Prime Minister and Minister Garrett that there will be no extension beyond 2013 of this inequitable funding model. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Already the Coalition has said they will extend the inequitable funding model. They are saying this is the death knell to education reform in Australia if the Coalition get in. So on this basis, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to properly fund education, and the Greens are saying we will support the legislation before the end of the year, and we will work to raise the money. We're not frightened of making hard decisions. The G8 communique recently said that the world has to stop subsidising fossil fuels. Well, in Australia, that's $9 billion a year. So if the government was serious about climate change and about education funding, the clear thing to do would be to move on this with the support of the Greens, legislate to implement the Gonski Review so we have a new funding model starting in 2014, and let's get the money now. That's what should happen, and the Prime Minister and Minister Garrett need to reassure the community that they are on track for this. Otherwise, the community is going to be devastated to learn that after 5 years of delay, Labor came in 2007, 5 years of delay, and we still haven't addressed this inequitable funding model in education.
Does Labor have the guts to stand up to the private school lobby?
Well, the great thing about the Gonski Review is that it tries to go beyond this fight between public and private schools and instead says, let's fund students on the basis of need. And because public education supports those students most in need overwhelmingly across the education system, then of course the lion's share of the funding will go into public schools. Now, of course, we've had new buildings in schools across the country because of the Building the Education revolution, but buildings aren't enough on their own. So much more needs to be done. There is a whole teaching community out there, parent community out there saying, let's do this properly. If we are going to be a competitive nation, an educated nation in this century, we have to invest in education. We cannot have a situation where there is a 5.5 years of education gap between the top 20% and the lowest 20% in Year 9. That is unacceptable. We have to do something about it, and this is going to be a real test for the Prime Minister and the Minister for Education as to whether they are prepared to legislate this year and whether they're prepared to raise the money, because the Greens are here ready to do it.
Does it become harder to implement the more years that pass?
Well, I think the only thing stopping the implementation of the Gonski Review is the political will. You know, we have to invest in education, and we have to recognise the disadvantage to those students at the bottom end in the education system. Our students need support. What we hear all the time is the big end of town asking for more and more concessions, more and more cutting back in terms of long fought-for reforms, and yet when everybody wants investment in education, it seems that there is a reluctance because they're afraid to raise the money. Well, we're here to raise that $5 billion a year, and it's up to the Prime Minister and the Minister for Education now to rule out any extension of the inequitable model beyond the end of 2013.
On the issue of the Four Corners program on people smugglers, should the government be revoking the visas of people found to be people smuggling from within Australia?
Well, certainly I think there are a number of questions that need to be asked in terms particularly of the Federal Police and ASIO. ASIO has managed to secure a huge new building, massive amounts of money and power. How is it that this situation that has been alleged in the media has been allowed to occur? So I think the first questions that need to be asked are, what is going on with ASIO and the Federal Police that this can apparently be happening under their very noses? But we would want to ensure that the full force of the law is brought against people engaged in people smuggling. Having said that, though, that shouldn't be confused with the plight of asylum seekers, who are often the most marginalised and people who are suffering and frequently are found to be genuine refugees. But certainly where people are engaged in people smuggling, then the full force of the law should be brought against them.
Do you think things like this do affect the public perception in this quite fiery public debate?
At one level, I think it perhaps may influence the perception about asylum seekers, but I think overwhelmingly the bigger thing that people are saying to me is, how on earth can this have happened under the very noses of ASIO and the Federal Police? Remember that ASIO gives security recommendations with regard to all of the asylum seekers, and a number of people have been told that they will be held indefinitely as a result of these security checks, and that is about to be challenged in the High Court. And because people are held indefinitely without any review, without being told exactly what it is they're being accused of, and yet we find here they've got those security checks holding people indefinitely, but other people have managed to get out and be classified as refugees. From the point of view of the community, what it does is really question ASIO and the Federal Police in relation to these security clearances and assessments.
OK, we'll leave that there. That was the Greens leader Christine Milne live from Hobart on a number of issues. One of those, the government's proposed native title changes, which Nicola Roxon revealed earlier this morning at that conference in Townsville. The Greens say the onus of proof in relation to native title claims must be reversed, that onus not be placed on Indigenous claimants.